My name is Sarah. I am 29 years old, and I work as a special education teacher. Last spring, I attended my brother's engagement party. I wore a blue dress I had bought on sale, and I kept mostly to myself near the back of the room. But midway through the evening, my future sister-in-law's mother stood up from her chair, looked directly at me in front of a table full of people, and smiled the kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. She said, "Oh, don't worry about Sarah, she's just a special ed teacher." A few people glanced at each other awkwardly. Someone laughed softly. I said nothing. I just nodded and looked down at my glass. But across the table, a man with gray temples and quiet eyes had gone very still. He was staring at me in a way that made the air around us feel different, like he was pulling at a thread somewhere deep in his memory. And something told me that when it finally came loose, everything in that room was going to change. But before I get to that moment, let me take you back to the beginning. My brother Daniel is 2 years older than me, and we have always been close in the way that people who grew up without much tend to be. Our parents divorced when I was 7. Our mother worked double shifts at a diner for most of our childhood, and our father moved to Phoenix and sent birthday cards that arrived 2 weeks late. We didn't grow up poor exactly, but we grew up careful. Careful with money, careful with words, careful with the space we took up in rooms that didn't belong to us. Daniel was always the charming one. He could walk into any situation and make people feel instantly at ease. He became a project manager at a construction firm, worked his way up steadily, and met Claire at a conference in Chicago 3 years ago. Claire was warm and funny and genuinely kind to me every time we crossed paths. I liked her immediately. I still do. Her family, though, was a different story. Claire came from old money. Not the flashy kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that shows up in the way people hold their wine glasses and the way they pause just a half second too long before responding when you tell them what you do for a living. Her mother, Margaret, was the sort of woman who had opinions about everything and delivered them in a tone so smooth it took you a moment to realize you had just been insulted. The engagement party was held at a private event space in the suburbs. Exposed brick walls, Edison bulb lighting, catering staff in black ties. It was the kind of place that tried very hard to look effortless. Daniel had been nervous all week. He'd called me twice the night before just to talk, which is his version of asking for reassurance without actually asking. I arrived alone. I had taken the train in from the city because parking downtown on a Saturday was a nightmare, and I was wearing the dress I mentioned, a simple navy blue wrap dress that I genuinely liked and had worn twice to parent-teacher conferences. I checked my coat, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, and scanned the room for my brother. I found him near the back, looking genuinely happy in a way that made my chest feel full. He hugged me for a long moment and introduced me to a few of his work colleagues whose names I forgot immediately. Claire found us a few minutes later and squeezed my hand. "You look beautiful," she said, and I believed her because she was looking at me when she said it, not at the room. Margaret was holding court at the main table when we arrived. She was a tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair swept back severely and a kind of practiced elegance that I imagine took decades to develop. She smiled when she saw Claire and said nothing to me, which I understood as a greeting. Claire's father, Robert, stood up when I approached. He was a quieter presence than his wife, a compact man with glasses and a measured way of speaking, the kind of person who seemed to be listening even when no one was talking to him. He shook my hand and asked me what I did, and when I told him I was a special education teacher, he nodded slowly and said, "That must be incredibly meaningful work." He said it simply, without the faint upward lilt that usually follows that sentence, the one that means, "But why would you choose that?" I liked him for it. The party moved through its early stages the way these things do. Toasts were made, stories were told, photographs were taken. Margaret introduced Claire to various family friends with a kind of proprietary pride that I noticed but chose not to think too hard about. Daniel circulated the room with a hand on Claire's back, and every time I caught his eye, he gave me a small, grateful look that I understood perfectly. I spent most of the first hour talking to Claire's younger cousin, a college student named Becca who was studying environmental science and had very strong opinions about composting. I liked her very much. The trouble started over dinner. The main table seated about 14 people. I had been placed near the end, between Becca and an older gentleman named Frank, who turned out to be Margaret's college roommate's husband and who spent most of the meal describing, in great detail, a fishing trip he had taken in Montana. I listened politely. Robert sat 3 seats down from me, next to Margaret, and spent most of the meal in quiet conversation with the woman on his other side. Midway through the entree, Margaret stood up. She tapped her knife lightly against her glass, and the table softened to a hush. She gave a short toast, warm in its intention toward Claire, precise in its phrasing, and carefully organized so that Daniel came across as acceptable rather than exceptional. Then she smiled around the table in that way she had, slow and commanding. She said she wanted everyone to know a little about the people sharing the table tonight. She introduced a few people, an old friend who had known Claire since preschool, a colleague of Robert's who had flown in from Boston, a cousin who had just been accepted to a law program in D.C. Each introduction came with a detail that made the person sound impressive or at least interesting. Then she glanced toward me. Her expression didn't change, her tone didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. She said, and you have to understand, she said this pleasantly, with a small, inclusive wave of her hand, like she was being generous by mentioning me at all. Oh, and this is Sarah, Daniel's younger sister. Don't mind her too much, she said with a little laugh. She's just a special ed teacher. The table responded in that awful group way where a few people laughed softly because they weren't sure if they were supposed to, and others looked down at their plates because they were sure they weren't. Someone murmured, "That's nice," in the direction of their water glass. I did not react. I have spent years learning not to react. I smiled gently because I am 30 years younger than Margaret, and I knew that anything I said would make Daniel's night worse, not better. And I told myself what I had told myself 100 times before, in rooms like this, that people like Margaret always reveal themselves, eventually, and the most dignified thing you can do is simply wait. What I did not expect was what happened next. Across the table, Robert had gone completely still. He had set his fork down. Not in the way people set forks down to gesture or to signal they're about to speak. He set it down quietly, almost carefully, and he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. It wasn't rude. It wasn't accusatory. It was the expression of a man who has just heard a sound he recognizes from a long time ago and is trying to locate it in his memory. The table moved on. Margaret was already asking the cousin about law school. Conversation resumed in overlapping currents the way it does. Frank made a joke about the fish in Montana, and the table laughed, and the moment passed. But Robert was still looking at me. After a few seconds, he looked away. He picked up his fork again. But twice in the next few minutes, I caught him glancing back, not curiously, not idly, but with that same quiet, focused intensity. Like someone slowly turning the dial on a radio, searching for a frequency. Claire noticed it too. She leaned slightly toward her father and said something softly that I couldn't hear. Robert shook his head once and said something back, and then he was quiet again. I want to stop here for one moment and tell you something about the work I actually do, because I think it matters to what comes next. I have been a special education teacher for 6 years. I work with elementary-age kids who have a range of learning disabilities, dyslexia, ADHD, autism spectrum, processing disorders. I work in a public school in a neighborhood that does not have a lot of resources. My classroom budget for the entire year is less than some people spend on a weekend trip. I share 2 paraprofessionals with 3 other teachers, and twice a week I stay late without pay because there are kids who need more time and I am not able to convince myself that a clock should determine that. I am not telling you this to be noble. I am telling you this because when Margaret said the word just a special ed teacher, she was talking about those kids. She was describing as small the work of teaching a 9-year-old boy named Marcus to read his own name for the first time and watching his face do something that I do not have a word for. She was minimizing the hours I spent learning sign-supported communication for a nonverbal girl in my class so that she could tell me when she was tired or scared or hungry without having to wait for someone to guess. She was dismissing the 3 voicemails I left for a parent last November because her son had started hitting himself during transitions, and I needed her to know before she heard it from someone else, and I needed her to know that I had a plan. There is no just in any of that. There is only the work. I held all of that quietly, the way I usually do. And I sat with my mostly full plate and listened to the conversation move around me like water around a stone. The dinner plates were cleared and dessert was set out. A 3-tiered cake appeared from somewhere, and photographs were taken, and Daniel held Claire's hand while people cheered. I watched my brother's face from across the room and felt something uncomplicated and clean, a happiness for him that had nothing to do with anything else that had happened that evening. Then Robert stood up. He stood up the way people stand up when they have made a decision. Slowly, deliberately, without theater. He didn't tap his glass. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, and something about his stillness made the nearby conversations fade on their own. He looked directly at me. "Sarah," he said, "I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I need to ask you something, and I need to ask you here." The table was quiet now. Daniel looked at me. Claire looked at her father. Robert said, "About 8 years ago. Did you do your student teaching placement at Birchwood Elementary?" My heart stopped moving for a second. "Yes," I said slowly. "I did. I was there for 1 semester, my 2nd year of grad school." Robert took a breath. He reached up and touched the bridge of his glasses in the way people do when they are trying to hold themselves together. He said, "Do you remember a student named Noah?" The room disappeared for a moment. Noah. 7 years old. Severe dyslexia, also being evaluated at the time for a processing disorder that nobody had quite named yet. He came into my student teaching placement in October, 3 weeks after the school year started, because his family had just moved to the district. He didn't talk much. He cried without sound sometimes, which is the kind of crying that stays with you. He had been told by at least one adult in his life, based on something he'd repeated to me once with the matter-of-factness of a child who has accepted a thing as true, that he was probably just not a reading kid. "I remember Noah," I said. "Of course I remember Noah." Robert's voice was very steady when he spoke next, but I could see the effort it took. He said, "Noah is my son." No one at the table moved. He said, "I want to tell you what you may not know. When Noah started at Birchwood that fall, my wife and I were at the end of our rope. We had been to 3 schools, 2 specialists, and 1 neuropsychologist who told us that Noah was intellectually capable but that his profile was complicated and that we should manage our expectations carefully. He was 7 years old, and he had already started telling us he was stupid. He would put his hands over his ears in the morning when it was time to get ready for school. He had stopped wanting to read bedtime stories because it reminded him of something he couldn't do." Robert paused. He looked at the table for a moment. "Then you came," he said. I shook my head slightly. "I was there for 3 months. I was a student teacher. I barely knew what I was doing." Robert looked at me and said, "You knew exactly what you were doing. You stayed with him after school twice a week, on your own time, without being asked. You created materials for him by hand because the ones available in the classroom weren't working for how his brain processed information. You called us, he stopped. You called us on a Thursday evening in November, and you told us that Noah was not behind. He was different, and that different and behind were not the same thing, and that you needed us to believe that before he could believe it himself." I remembered that phone call. I remembered standing in the parking lot of my apartment complex in the dark with my phone pressed against my ear because I had been trying to reach them for a week. Robert said, "My wife and I have thought about that phone call more times than I can count. Not just because of what you said, but because of when you said it. Because we had almost stopped. We had started looking at other options. Residential programs. Specialists in other states. He paused again, we were not in a good place as a family. And something about the way you spoke about our son that night made us feel like there was still ground under our feet." He removed his glasses and set them on the table. He said, "Noah is 15 now. He reads above grade level. He wrote a short story last year that won a district competition. He wants to study film when he goes to college because he says he thinks in pictures and he has finally figured out how to make that a strength instead of a problem. And every time I watch him do something like that, every single time I think about you. I think about a 21-year-old student teacher who stayed late and called us in the dark and refused to use the word just when she talked about our kid. The room was very quiet. I was not going to cry. I had made a private rule against crying at events that weren't my own. But I was having a significant amount of trouble with that rule at that particular moment. Robert turned toward Margaret. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He said, simply and without cruelty, "I need to say something. When you introduced Sarah earlier, you called her just a special ed teacher. I know you didn't mean harm by it, but I want to tell you, in front of everyone here, that a special ed teacher is the reason my son knows who he is. A special ed teacher is the reason he has a future he's excited about. And if there is a just in front of that title anywhere in this room, I need it removed." Margaret was very still. She opened her mouth once and then closed it. Daniel was looking at me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. It was the expression of someone watching a room finally see something he has always known. Claire reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I said the only thing I could think to say, which was the same thing I always say, which was that I was just doing my job. Robert shook his head. "No," he said, "you are doing something much harder than that. You are doing the job nobody sees. You are doing the job that doesn't have a salary that impresses anyone at a dinner table, and you are doing it for a little boy who needed someone to bet on him before the odds said to. That is not just anything. That is everything." He sat back down. He picked up his glasses. He put them back on. The conversations at the table resumed slowly, the way sounds come back after something loud. Someone asked Daniel a question about the honeymoon. A waiter appeared with more cake. The music in the background, which had gone somehow unnoticed during the last several minutes, was still playing. Becca, next to me, leaned over and said quietly, "I have never respected anyone more in my life." I laughed, which surprised me, and which released something tight that had been sitting in my chest since Margaret's toast. For the rest of the evening, I noticed people looking at me differently. Not the way Margaret had looked at me, past me, through me, but with a kind of attention that felt warm rather than appraising. A woman I hadn't met introduced herself and told me her nephew had had a wonderful special ed teacher who had changed his trajectory completely. An older man asked me questions about how learning differences were diagnosed and listened to my answers with genuine interest. Frank from Montana said, "Well, that beats fishing," and somehow that was the funniest thing I had heard all year. Margaret was quieter than she had been all evening. She did not avoid looking at me exactly, but the smooth, effortless confidence she had moved through the room with earlier had changed into something that looked less certain of itself. I did not feel triumphant about that. I want to be honest about that. I have been underestimated by people like Margaret my entire adult life, and I have been lucky enough to learn that their opinions of my work have very little to do with the actual value of my work. What happened that night wasn't about winning something. It was about something quieter and more permanent than that. It was about Noah, who I had thought about once in a while over the years and wondered how he was doing. It was about the fact that the phone call I made in a dark parking lot because I was 21 years old and refused to accept that a 7-year-old had already been written off, that phone call had mattered, that it had landed, that it was still living somewhere 8 years later in a 15-year-old kid who wanted to make films and had figured out that thinking in pictures was a gift and not a deficiency. That is why I do this work. Not for the dinners. Not for the introductions. Not for the salary, which I will not pretend is sufficient for what it requires of a person. I do it because there are children sitting in classrooms right now who have been told, in 100 small ways, that they are the problem when the truth is that the problem is the gap between how they learn and how they are being taught, and someone has to stand in that gap. Someone has to stay late and make materials by hand and call parents in parking lots in the dark. That someone will never be described at a dinner party in a way that commands a room. They will rarely be the most impressive person in a conversation about salaries or status or the kind of success that photographs well. They will be just a teacher, just a nurse, just a social worker, just a librarian, as though the word just were a fair assessment of the weight they carry. It is not. Daniel found me near the end of the evening when the guests were beginning to collect their coats. He hugged me for a long time and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I knew, I always knew." And I held on to him and thought about how much easier this life is when someone has always known. Robert found me near the door as I was getting ready to leave. He shook my hand again, both hands this time, and said something I have been thinking about since. He said, "I hope you know that every child you teach has a parent somewhere who is holding their breath. And every time you do your job the way you did it for Noah, you give that parent permission to breathe again. That is not a small thing. That is not a just anything. Please don't let anyone make you feel that it is." I walked to the train station alone in the spring night air with my coat buttoned against the chill, and I thought about Noah making films. I thought about the way he used to trace letters with his finger on the desk when he was frustrated, the private rhythm he had developed for working through something hard. I thought about the materials I made for him by hand, cutting and laminating color-coded cards at my kitchen table after midnight, and how I had not thought of that as sacrifice at the time because it simply felt like what needed to be done. I thought about the way he had come to me one afternoon in early December, about 6 weeks before my placement ended, and shown me a sentence he had written on his own. 11 words. His handwriting was enormous and uneven, and there was a word in the middle spelled in a way that made complete phonetic sense even if it wasn't standard, and he had looked at me with his whole face open and asked me if it was good. I told him it was the best sentence I had read all day. He had looked down at the paper for a moment, very still, and then he said, "I think I might be a words kid after all." I had managed to hold it together until he walked away, and then I turned toward the whiteboard and stood there for a little while until I could. 8 years later, on a train moving through the dark back toward the city, I sat with my coat in my lap and thought about how much can change in the life of one child when one adult refuses to use the word just. I thought about all the Noahs I have had since. The ones I know about, and the ones I will never hear from again. The ones who are somewhere right now doing something that someone once told them they couldn't do. And I thought about Margaret, and about every room I have ever stood in while someone described my work as just and. I thought that the great gift of what happened tonight was not that I was publicly vindicated, though I will admit that being publicly vindicated felt significantly better than the alternative. The great gift was that Robert said it out loud. That he stood up in a room full of people who were comfortable being comfortable, and he told the truth in the quiet, certain voice of a man who had been given something irreplaceable and had never forgotten who gave it to him. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for a room to recognize what they do. I had spent 6 years telling myself I didn't need that the work itself was enough, that a child reading above grade level was its own reward, that the approval of rooms like that one had nothing to do with the value of what I offered every single day. And I had believed it. I mostly still believe it. But I will not pretend that it didn't matter. I will not pretend that standing in that room and hearing Robert speak, hearing the name Noah, hearing the words thinking in pictures, hearing the future my hours had helped build spoken back to me by someone who had been there to watch it grow. I will not pretend that did not reach something in me that had been quiet for a long time. It did. And on the train home, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let it. The lesson I came home with that night was not about revenge, and it was not about Margaret getting what she deserved, though I would be lying if I said the look on her face after Robert finished speaking was not stored somewhere useful in my memory. The lesson was this. The work you do when no one is watching, the calls you make in dark parking lots, the materials you cut by hand at midnight, the bets you place on children that no one else is willing to make that work does not disappear. It goes somewhere. It lives in the people it touches, and sometimes, years later, it walks back into a room and says your name. And when it does, no one in that room will be able to say the word just again without knowing exactly how wrong they are.